I'm probably never going to call your parents mine, but men would sit down and be like, what the fuck about a lot of our culture if the roles were reversed and they had to change their name? We made a video and it got a lot of attention, lots of like comments from people.
Good and bad.
Yes. I'm really glad that a lot of women interacted and spoke about things that they were going through in their lives because it is a taboo topic,
Yeah.
the relationship that women have to share with their mother-in-laws. That was heartbreaking, but it was also really nice that so many women felt safe enough to open up about things that they were going through. And then there were some very problematic, alarming comments.
Yeah, of people who were, I guess, offended or triggered by what they maybe perceived as a challenge to
Yes.
their idea of
People.
families, men,
Yes, mostly men.
mostly men. This is a thing that happens, I think, when you criticize or when you comment or critique or raise questions about something to do with
Patriarchy.
or like, yeah, patriarchy in this case, as well as like people's long-standing like accepted cultural like beliefs,
Biases.
yeah, about identity and like what culture means to them, what family means to them, things that they probably like received from a very young age and have not really questioned, or if they questioned it, were probably met with fierce like pushback.
I mean, I don't want to go into glorifying or explaining why they did it, but yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
That made me want to like have a conversation together about things that I think, definitely discussed. We've discussed for a long time with each other, with friends, with family. I think a lot of people in our community talk about it because it's an issue. But I don't see a lot of people speaking about family dynamics or these relationship equations in the open, in public. I don't see people talking about it. I definitely think it's more of an issue in like brown communities than it is in a Western community, even though I know we have movies like Monster-in-Law,
Yeah.
for example, which talks about like how toxic that relationship can be.
Right.
But I think it's a little more intense and serious and more debilitating for women in brown cultures.
Yeah, I guess it's a cultural trope around the world, but I suppose in Western culture, it's like your interaction with your in-laws is maybe a lot more limited. The idea of family is more nuclear than, I guess, in Indian culture.
Yeah, because as women, I think your identity is attached to, your husband and his family. And so I guess what I want to talk about is one, largely, of course, that do you have to like your mother-in-law if she doesn't really like you? And a bigger question that I have is, why do I have to call your mother Ma? Or why do women in general, like this isn't just about me, but why do women, when they get married, have to call their mother-in-laws by Ma or Papa or Mom and Dad or any other equation, like, like version of that name or that relationship when they're not, in fact, actually their parents?
I guess the superficial answer to that is that when you are in a relationship, that one person's parents become the other person's parents and vice versa. Yeah, it's kind of this artificial way of looking at things that because you're together, everyone is a giant, big, happy entity, and like we're all parents and children together.
Which is not how it actually happens, right? Like in reality, your parents are not my parents. Like they're your parents. Why is there an expectation that I would call your mom and dad, mine, papa, when they're not actually my parents? Like they're never going to be my parents.
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, they're going to choose me.
Exactly. Yeah, they're going to choose you. And I know there's a lot of people who are probably the exception to the rule who will say that, but like, my mother-in-law would take my side and not my husband's side.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Great. But 9 out of 10 times that doesn't happen.
That's not the norm.
That's not the norm. Mothers will always choose their sons.
Yeah.
And fair enough, because that is your child.
Yeah.
Right. For example, if you have been married and divorced 3 times, like your mom's not going to have 3 daughters.
Yeah. That relationship ends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It ends once your relationship with the woman ends, so does the family's relationship in most cases.
Yeah.
Like, and same goes for my mother, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
if I've been with multiple people, then I'm always going to remain my mother's child, right? So
Yeah.
then it just doesn't make sense why we have to pretend our partner's parents, especially for women, you know, like the man's parents become your parents.
Yeah. It's like conditional on you being with the person's son. Right.
Exactly. And to me, it's actually very like confronting because also it doesn't make any sense. We already, as people, like most of us, struggle with our relationships with our parents. We're still, as adults, trying to figure out how to not be triggered and how to like come to terms with how we feel or how we react with our own parents. So why are we actually trying to replicate a relationship that we don't quite understand how to maintain or make healthy, and we're like, oh, let's go and get 2 more parents. Just
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
We should acknowledge it, I think, as being an inherently like a different relationship rather than culturally pretending that it's the same kind of equation that you have, because then that inevitably leads to missed expectations or conflict and dynamics that are set up to fail in a way.
This is a taboo topic, and people would be really triggered that we're even suggesting that your partner's parents are not actually your parents. They're your partner's parents, and you should respect them and be cordial and do all those things, but they're not your mom and dad, right?
Yeah.
Especially for women, because the expectation is always that women are this pariah dhan or like amanat in a family, and you know, one day you're gonna get married and that's your family now. Yeah, like in so many communities, women change their name when they get married because that's your new identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So weirdly, you're supposed to act like this is your new family, but then, I mean, this is something you had said about how then I guess women don't really belong to either families.
Yeah, I suppose the role of women in society is to perform a duty, whereas for, I mean, traditional ideas of society is that women perform a duty like raising kids, looking after in-laws, looking after their parents before that.
Birthing like the man's legacy, or like
legacy.
lineage.
Yeah. Whereas obviously now like that kind of idea of women's role doesn't allow them to have an identity of their own, which doesn't leave space for them to have disagreements or to have self-respect. And the very idea that they might not like their mother-in-laws or might not want to equate them with their own parents kind of threatens that idea of family in a lot of ways.
Because you are, yeah, and you're supposed to. Like, the expectation is that you'd put your partner's parents and your like husband's family above your own.
Yeah.
After a point, right? Like, that is what a good daughter-in-law is. She's the one that keeps the family together. And then really what you're always upholding is that system. Whether your mother-in-law or you, and usually the husband is just like ignorant about these things, but you're upholding a system that protects them and their peace. So then technically you are the daughter and that is your parents, but under like certain terms and conditions.
Yeah, I guess it's a patriarchal society at the end of the day, which places men, specifically the sons and their family, at the top of a hierarchy, and the women are expected to sort of engage in that hierarchy, but they don't occupy like a position of power within that. As I said, they're to sort of play a role rather than have their own identity or their own kind of space.
That is why I guess you go from like being owned by your father to then your husband.
Yeah.
Right. And there is no space where they have an identity of their own. And at the end of the day, the relationship is so, I guess, fragile, because I could very much like snap back at my mother or have like a fight with her about my values, but there is absolutely no way that that would be acceptable if I did that with like your mother. You
Yeah.
know, like women can't fight back with their in-laws
Yeah.
the same way they could with their parents. So only the really like toxic, obedient parts of now you have 2 more parents really apply.
Yeah.
The other parts don't apply.
Yeah, it's not the same equation at all. And you don't have the same capacity for like back and forth that you would have with your own parents. You're expected to sort of play a role, and like when you're get into conflict or whatever, the kind of different types of relationship really reveal itself between in-laws and like your parents. There's a certain like limit that you can't cross, and that limit is actually quite narrow if you think about it.
Yeah, and then that is why you keep like shrinking yourself. Not only did you shrink yourself when you went from like a child to an adult, but then you're further shrinking yourself when now you have four parents and like you can't really speak to any of them. And I want to like clarify that even though this applies to men as well, because you are also supposed to call, your supposed like wife's parents, mom and dad. But the relationship that you share with them is nowhere what women are supposed to share with their in-laws.
Yeah, it comes from a completely different place, right? Like for the son to go over to his in-laws' house, that's usually treated as like a big occasion. You're expected in like a very superficial way to refer to them as like your mother and father-in-law and treat them with respect, obviously. But when you go over to visit them, well, in that equation, the one who holds the power is always the son. They're like treated like royalty when they go over to to their in-laws' place. Not really expected to stay for too long, and that would be very unusual if they did.
Yeah, you'd be like a ghar jamai if you lived with them.
Yeah,
which is an
exactly.
insult. It's not a compliment.
It's an equation where, again, like the sons don't give up much of their identity or don't have to give up any of their identity in order to be accepted. Whereas the expectation is for women that they would have to be part of the son's family, or that they would take on that role and treat the son's parents as though they were their own in a much more like comprehensive way.
It's interesting you say that because like yeah, men are treated very differently when they go to their in-laws' houses, and very much treated like royalty. But I think that also comes from a place of wanting, because I've had these conversations at home with my family out of mostly curiosity and frustration to understand where the mindset comes from. And I think it comes from protecting your daughter's life, making sure that she's happier in her new house with her new family. And for that, you make sure he's happy, because if he's not happy, it's going to come out on her and they're going to treat her like shit. So you give him the best treatments, because God forbid if he leave her, then her life is just over. Like divorce is a huge taboo for women.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's why we usually act like, our son-in-laws are just kings and like princes, and they're supposed to be treated so well. And I think at the heart of it, it comes from a good, like, well-intention, because you're really just looking out for your daughter and making sure she's happy. Because if you snap at him or just don't give him much attention, him and his family are not going to treat her well, which goes back to my first point that they're not really her family.
I get why it's difficult for like women, especially like independent women, to be faced with this expectation of like, oh, I have to like treat my partner's parents like my own parents, no matter how they treat me or whatever. And I see why that's troubling. But
Or like, I mean, sorry, I'm cut you off. It's not just when they're like horrible. I have a feeling that it comes
Yeah.
across as like, oh, they treat me really poorly. And in that case, of course you shouldn't.
Yeah.
But even if your in-laws are amazing and like love you and it's a healthy dynamic, there shouldn't be an expectation that you replace your parents or
Yeah.
tell them ma and ba.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can if you want to, but it's not an expectation that should be like, if you don't do that, somehow you're failing at
Yeah.
this whole relationship.
Because really, you could actually have a better relationship with them without calling them ma and pa.
Yeah.
And maybe you call them mama and papa, but like absolutely hate their guts. So
Right.
I think the healthier one is to just share a good relationship regardless of whether you call them like XYZ.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
it makes sense to like build your own equation, right? Like, and I understand that should be the expectation rather than this like forced upon kind of dynamic where there's a lot of expectations which may not align with like how people actually feel inside, right? Like, and there's always going to be an internal conflict, and that's going to cause problems for everyone involved at some point, right? On the flip side, isn't it also like, doesn't it come from a good place that like once you get married or once you're in a long-term relationship, that you treat your in-laws as though they're your parents. You know, like for people that are brought up in that culture, or like for men who are brought up seeing their mothers and like how they might, interact with their in-laws, and like, there's a lot of cultural
Sure, but you also
background.
see a lot of men like glorifying all the sacrifices their mothers make and then expecting the
Sure.
same from their wives. So I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. I think the idea behind like, oh, happy family, everybody loves each other is great.
Yeah.
But that can't be done by replicating the same relationships
Yeah.
and expecting that women give up their whole identity. But I get that like it's hard for men as well, right? Like in that whole space because they're not raised to think about any of this.
Mm. Kind
It's
of.
like a lot of politics that women are playing with each other, but men aren't really a part of it.
Yeah, it's just like received kind of like cultural norms. These are the roles that like I would expect, like that I've seen my mother play or the other women in my family play in the family. And so when I choose a partner, they will also take on these roles because it's nice, everyone gets along, and my mother is amazing, and all that sort of
Which is a
stuff.
privilege. Like
Yeah.
it's the ignorance comes from a kind of privilege where it doesn't impact their lives at all. And I've said this very often. Men would sit down and be like, what the fuck about a lot of our culture if the roles were reversed and they had to change their name,
Yeah.
and they had to like go live in their in-laws house,
Yeah.
or like give up their family or not have property under their name, like if they were seen as pariah dhan.
Yeah.
A lot of this would just like dismantle and they'd be like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. But they don't question it because it doesn't impact them, which is part of the larger problem for me.
Yeah, there's a level of like ignorance that it's not my problem or whatever. And then
And why is it such a big deal? We can all be happy.
yeah.
It's just a last name, like who cares?
Yeah, it's kind of like a tip of the iceberg thing. So if you looked at it in isolation, it would be like, oh, what's the big deal? But then if you delve down the system that like this supports, it becomes very clear that this is an unrealistic expectation to have. It doesn't, I guess, align maybe with how our society functions now, how it's evolving and developing. We're no longer living in those circumstances that maybe our parents' generation did, where there was a lot more people living in joint families, a lot less women having their own careers and independence.
Yeah.
And
I've also, like, on that note, I have had conversations at home where, like, family members have told me that in their time, the best daughters, being daughter-in-laws, were the ones that were married into their family at a very young age. And the ones that they loved the most are the ones that held their in-laws at a much higher level than their own parents. Like,
Yeah.
because that's why you marry them young, so that
Mm.
they forget whatever, like, if you're married at like 13, 14, which is ridiculous, from your like period to like your growth to the person you become happens with the guy's family. So really technically that's your family. And that's like glorified. Like when they talk about it, they were like, that was such a beautiful like custom,
Yeah.
and it was the right way to do this. Now women are getting married at 30 and they just have too much of a self identity and like, this is who I am and these are my likes and dislikes, and those women don't merge well into the guy's family, and that's apparently a problem.
That's kind of like a troubling thing that reveals about the like reward consequences kind of mechanism that they have. Like if you behave in a certain way as a woman and you treat the boy's family as your own or better than your own family, you will be showered with affection
Yes.
and praise. And there's kind of like a what does
You're
that
doing
really,
well.
what does that like reveal about the role of women in society, if not that they are expected to basically look after their in-laws? They're expected to play a role. They're not loved for who they are as people, like more than they are loved for playing that role.
Which, by the way, like, it's crazy, but it's a very well crafted system that like protects and helps men, right? At
Yeah.
the end of the day, because surprisingly, the same kind of attitude would be looked down upon and completely rejected if men did it. If you liked your in-laws more and put them first and loved them more and like thought about them before your own parents, people would be like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
The system is failing.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's not how you're supposed to do it.
We
The same-
raised you, and how did you
Yeah.
like how could you put someone else like above us or something like
Yeah.
that? Like that
You've
would be
forgotten your values.
yeah.
It's like looked down upon and men did it, but completely like, I guess, celebrated and praised when women do it.
Yeah, this comes from a an idea of what families should be, or what the role of families should be. More traditionally in like brown cultures, the family is there basically to like support the development of children, and like
the
in a
man.
patriarchal society,
Yeah.
it serves the male members of the household.
That is why families came into picture, right? So that
Yeah.
men could like go off and work and do things.
Exactly. And in those societies, women were seen as like liabilities because they were not earning members of the family, but their role is very much confined to like the household. As society has like rapidly transformed in India and other similar cultures, that role of like the family unit no longer fits with the reality in a lot of places of like women are more educated, they are working, they kind of have to work in some circumstances, maybe from a younger age, to provide for their own families growing up. And so that idea that suddenly when you get married, you put all that to one side, or you sort of put that subordinate to you playing a role in your partner's family.
Plain canvas that comes into the house.
There's always going to be a clash there now. And so maybe the idea is that, or the solution or the way forward is that the idea of family needs to evolve to reflect the reality of what society is like nowadays. Like the old model of families where women don't have their own identity or don't have their own likes, dislikes, their own say, their own like position within the family of their own, where they can occupy a similar space to like the men in the family.
Yeah.
That idea needs to be updated. And I guess as maybe society evolves, the idea of family also needs to evolve to make space for the independent women that we're raising. And it needs to grow
unintentionally. You know, it's not that people are actively trying to raise independent women. I think it's just happening by fluke, but I'm glad it's happening. Yeah, I agree. Can I ask a personal question?
Okay.
It just randomly came to my mind.
Okay.
To state the obvious, I don't know what it's like to be a man. I have an idea of the privilege, but I don't really know what it feels like. Is there one thing in this whole scenario that you think would help men to deal with this better? Knowing that they have the capability to like have more ownership over their own decisions and what kind of space they occupy. So what would you say?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah, because it's not like this whole thing isn't about like blaming men. I think they obviously benefit from patriarchy, but I think a lot of them are just born into it.
Yeah.
And will remain powerless till they realize and accept that they can make changes.
Yep. That system that we live in, which expects like women to conform to certain roles and men to play certain roles, doesn't actually work for a lot of men, right? Like in the long run, it doesn't help. There's a lot of pressure on men to be the breadwinners, to not have emotions, to kind of like be in control at all times. And that's not what a lot of men actually want to do. There's a lot of like depression amongst men as well, because there's this internal conflict, I think, between the roles that you're expected to play, which seem like very manly, masculine things to do and are very glorified in our society, but they come in the way like maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you want to be with a partner with whom you share like an equal relationship. Maybe you want to be with someone who has their own identity, their own personality, their own things that you could learn from, as well as like exchange ideas with. What do you want in a partner? If you want a partner who is deferential or like obedient, why do you want that? Like, why is that?
Where does that
something
come
that's
from?
glorified? Or why do you want to spend your life with someone that isn't like your equal? I don't know. That to me
I guess
doesn't.
because it gives you this false feeling of power, which is actually, as we discussed, not real power.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, look how happy men of that generation are. Like as a general stereotype, they're usually like withdrawn, cold, a bit detached,
Rigid, like not attuned with their feelings.
quite lonely.
Yeah.
Um,
Misunderstood.
yeah. And how much happier would they be if they opened their heart up a little bit for connection with someone that they thought was their equal, or
Which they do with other men, actually.
Sure.
which they absolutely do with other men in their relationships with men. They see them as equals, but with your partner, you're just not raised to see her as an equal. In
Yeah.
heterosexual relationships, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And
So you think be more curious and maybe question things that you're conditioned with or raised with.
yeah, why do you want that, and how does
Have
that
your
serve
own,
you?
yeah, and have your own set of values rather than just carrying on the ones that your parents had.
Yeah, because if you are an independent, strong male, then how does it make sense to adopt ideas that you've like never really thought about yourself to basically perpetuate systems of control that don't really serve you?
Thank you for answering the
That
question.
was very rambling, but
No, that was good. That was good. You were thinking out loud, but I'm glad we had this chat. I know a lot of people are going to be very triggered by it, but I'm really glad we talked about it.
yeah, me too.
I'm probably never going to call your parents ma-in-law.
Okay.
But I think people should come up with nicknames that actually serve the relationship. I think that's my takeaway from this.
I would any day rather define the relationship however makes sense. Like find a middle ground rather than acting out this like play where everyone's playing some sort of role which is not grounded in reality.
Yeah.
It's much better to have honest relationships.
Which is hard, and I think that's where the struggle comes from because I may have that idea as a woman, and you may be like, shit, I don't even know what's happening, but it's really a war between like the parents and the women, right? Like, and men are caught in the middle, but like that doesn't sound very powerful to me at all.
I mean, are you really caught in the middle? If you have your own ideas, then you should follow your own ideas, whatever you think.
Yeah, I just don't think they have their own ideas. Like a lot of women
Sure.
are now unintentionally being raised in a way where they're questioning things and trying to take up more space.
Yeah.
And I think while that's happening, men also need to like question things and the way that they were raised. Only then would it work together.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're constantly going to feel powerless and stuck and sandwiched and all of these things that don't serve them in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if the basis of your beliefs is mom and dad told me, so it's true, like, then maybe you need to interrogate those a little bit more.
I've dated some very strong, smart, creative men. When you ask them why do you want a child, it's because my parents would want a grandchild, and that's just like,
yeah,
how can you possibly? That can't be the reason to bring life into the world.
Yeah.
Because my parents want it.
Yeah, like what do you want? Is that what you want? Do you want to have a child now at 25, or do you want to have a child at 35? Like once you've achieved some of the things that you want to achieve in life, like men don't really think in that way. It's just like a received kind of thing that like this is what my parents want, so I'm gonna do that. That has to be a very limiting way to live your life.
Yeah, it sounds really suffocating for both parties, you know?
What's your identity then?
Yeah. Okay, I really hope people take away something from this conversation, and I would really like if people asked their own questions that come up that they would like us to talk about.
Yeah, we've got lots of time.
This has been fun. I mean, this is what we do off camera anyway,
Yeah.
so it's really nice to be able to do it on camera.
Yeah, I like it for the next conversation.
Yeah. Well, really.